Okay. Shall we get started? Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Carrie Bettinger Lopez. I'm a law professor at University of Miami Law School, where I direct the Human Rights Clinic. And we focus a lot in our clinic and in my scholarship and teaching on issues of feminist policy, both domestic and foreign, and connecting the dots between the two. And I've had the great honor and privilege to get to know many of our panelists over the past many years of my work, including time when I served in the Obama-Biden administration as the White House advisor on violence against women. I have the pleasure and honor of moderating this panel today. And so we're going to be hearing about feminist foreign policy views from the field. I'm going to give us just a brief introduction to what you'll be hearing about, and then turn it over to our speakers, who are going to speak collectively for about a half hour about their various perspectives. I'll introduce each of them as they come on to share their ideas. Then we'll engage in about a half hour of Q&A between myself and the panelists, and have a group discussion. And then for the last half hour of the program, we'll open it up to your questions and answers, and hopefully answer those questions, and really look forward to that engagement. We're at a very pivotal time, of course, in the United States in terms of thinking about feminist policies and feminist foreign policy, and as well as worldwide. And we've seen so many developments over the course of the past several years. And of course, you'll be hearing more about a very important book that was published last fall by Markham, called Feminist Foreign Policy Views from the Field. And so a lot of the ideas that you'll hear today are reflected in that book. And I highly recommend that you check it out. It's on Amazon. It's on all the web-based platforms. Make sure your libraries have it. Make sure it's in your collection. It's a must-read. So just to kind of give an overview of our discussion today, we're focused on kind of this pivotal time that we're in, when governments are grappling with numerous complex challenges. And we have to think about how more traditional approaches to foreign and security policy need to be potentially rethought. We also need to question underlying assumptions about gender, power, and security. Feminist foreign policy has emerged as a new paradigm. It's built on legal frameworks, feminist international relations theory, women's movements, and the women, peace, and security agenda. Feminist foreign policy, or FFP, as we often use our acronym SOUP, is a bold commitment. It signals to those both inside government, but also folks inside civil society and internationally in states around the world, that gender equality is a foreign policy goal and fundamental to peace, security, and stability. So our panel today will address how feminist foreign policy differs from traditional foreign policy, or one that's focused on advancing the rights of women and girls. Our panelists will discuss both the theory and the practice of feminist foreign policy, and we're going to have examples from two countries, Colombia and Germany, who are implementing a feminist foreign policy. We'll also highlight the perspective of civil society advocates on this issue. So while feminist foreign policy differs across countries, it encompasses key principles, and we want you to walk away from our session today understanding those principles. We want you to understand this framework to integrate gender equity across diplomacy, foreign assistance, defense, and security cooperation, as well as trade. Feminist foreign policy widens the definition of security and addresses historic power imbalances. It values more diverse voices in policymaking from both inside and outside government. And I will say that having also just emerged myself from taking a leave of absence from academia and serving at the U.S. Department of Justice for the past several years, many of these questions have been paramount for the Biden-Harris administration, as well on the domestic policy front. And as we just created the first ever U.S. national plan to end gender-based violence, we consolidated a domestic policy strategy that was largely influenced and informed by both feminist foreign policies from around the world, as well as the thinking about the value of how feminist policy, both domestic and foreign, has such a value add in terms of both policymaking and real impact in the lives of women and people all around the world. So very excited for our conversation today. Our order of speaking, we'll kick it off with Stephanie Foster, then turn it over to Susan Markham, then Gayatri Patel, Elizabeth Franz, and Ambassador Arlene Ticknor. Without further ado, I will introduce Stephanie Foster. Stephanie is the co-founder of Smash Strategies, a former senior advisor and counselor to the ambassador at large for global women's issues. She at the State Department. She's a senior advisor. She was a former senior advisor to the coordinator for Afghan relocation efforts at the U.S. Department of State, and a former professional lecturer and executive in residence at the American University Women and Politics Institute. So Stephanie, over to you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Carrie, for moderating, and to ASIL for hosting us, and to all the panelists who Susan and I sort of asked to help us with this conversation. What I'm going to focus on very briefly is really expounding on what Carrie just talked about, which is kind of what is feminist foreign policy and how did we get here? There's certainly a lot to say, but those three words were put together really for the first time in 2014, officially by Margot Wallström, then the foreign minister of Sweden. And in the ensuing 10 years, we have at least 16 countries, maybe a few more, who have either established or are in the process of establishing and implementing either a feminist foreign policy, development policy, or trade policy. And some do two of the three, or some are only focused really on in one of those areas. This is really, as Carrie said, a moment in time where the world is obviously, as we all know, a very challenging place. That there are conflicts in many parts of the world. It's a different day than when our international institutions were established. Those institutions that we've relied on for so many years, the post-World War II era of the UN and the World Bank, and all of these institutions that have really brought us to where we are. But they are you either think they don't work at all, or you think they're lacking in their ability to really help us forge a new way forward, so that we are living in a world that's peaceful, prosperous, and secure, as opposed to a world that's fraught with conflict and instability. The latter, a world fraught with conflict and instability, is always worse for women and girls, for children. And it's really important that as we think about foreign policy globally, we think about the impact of foreign policy on people. We often, I think, have been in a situation working in these institutions, certainly in the United States, where it's much more about the sort of bigger picture policy framework, bilateral relations between governments, and the impact on people isn't always brought to the forefront and factored into discussions of foreign policy. So feminist foreign policy is really a way to do just that, to bring a lot of those views in. And again, Susan will talk more about what we've seen is common across countries, but how to really broaden security and how we think about what it means to live in a peaceful, secure, and prosperous world. One thing to say at the outset, which is, this set of policies are called feminist. That can be for some people an off-putting term, but really, I think it does capture very well what this set of ideas is about, that we need to center the way that foreign policy is implemented, thinking about the impact more broadly, not just on women and girls, but on the way that we think about the world, and in the way that we see gender equality as integral to the efforts, both domestically and internationally, in terms of policy making and policy implementation. Just to put a pin in here about how Susan and I came to be involved with this, we have written several white papers, initially really looking at the intersection of the women, peace, and security agenda and feminist foreign policy. And what we found in doing that, to our, I think, surprise, was that there was not a lot of overlap between the practitioners in those areas. At the time we did that, there were maybe 5 people, and we think we were 2 of them. But that's, I think, a little bit more widespread now, but really coming to understand that feminist foreign policy came out of a set of different agendas, different international kind of legal frameworks, and it's all been knit together in this new and different way of thinking about policy. As again, Carrie said, we looked at in our book how the Beijing conferences, the World Conferences on Women, the human rights frameworks, legal frameworks, feminism, abolition, anti-slavery movements, all these things coming together over time to really bring us to where we are. International feminist international relations theory, women, peace, and security agenda. All of these different strains of thought have really been woven together across these governments and across the work of civil society to bring us to this point, which is looking at really developing and deepening what feminist foreign policy is. I want to leave you all with this thought as we start this conversation, and as hopefully you are interested in this topic and keep going. There is, as far as we have worked on in terms of this book, there really isn't one answer to the question, what is a feminist foreign policy? As Susan will talk about, there are things we found that are common to these policies, but it's an evolving field, and that's why it's exciting. As we know, it started in Sweden. The idea of feminist foreign policy is now all over the world in many regions. It's not necessarily only something that countries in Northern Europe or the Western or Northern Western Hemisphere are working on or are implementing. It's really taking hold in Latin America, now more and more in Asia. And we see that a lot of civil society groups across the globe are really taking this up and using it to advocate with their governments about how to change their outward-facing policy. So this is an interesting time. It's exciting. There are certainly a lot of countries that are taking this on, a lot of civil society actors that are excited about the prospect of using feminist foreign policy as a way to really move forward in terms of changing the way that their governments interact bilaterally and also multilaterally, and of course with people on the ground. So with that, Carrie, I'll turn it back over to you, and I know we're going to have time for questions, of course.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was a wonderful overview and really gets us warmed up. We're now going to turn it over to Susan Markham, who's going to tell us more about the principles of foreign policy and more about some of the issues explored in the book that she and Stephanie wrote. Susan is the co-founder of Smash Strategies, along with Stephanie, and is a gender advisor to the Halifax International Security Forum. She's a former USAID Senior Gender Coordinator, former Director of Women's Political Participation at the National Democratic Institute, and Gender Development and Foreign Policy course lecturer for Carnegie Mellon University, amongst others. And yeah, Stephanie and Susan and I had a lot of fun collaborating about a decade ago now on all of these issues. So Stephanie, Susan, over to you.
Great, thanks so much, and it's so good to be here with everyone. I would like to say, with Stephanie, following on what she said, like, the idea of there not being one definition is awesome. It's very feminist, right? The point isn't to have one common definition. It's the point to give people the power to implement what they want and finding it within their own communities and their own countries to figure out what foreign policy means for them. So I think it's a really exciting time. We did try to, one of the hardest things about writing the book is we both come from an advocacy background. And so we're used to saying a lot of like shoulds and woulds in the paper. And after we wrote the book, we're like, oh no, we're supposed to be unbiased. We're supposed to be just like writing it down of how it is. And so we had to circle back a couple times to try to create that baseline, because we do think things are moving fast now. And we wanted to just create that kind of base knowledge of where this all started, so that as it goes and continues to evolve, that will have that background. So when we were looking, we did think, I thought that when we got together and looked at all the countries that had said they were having a feminist foreign policy, that they would be kind of similar. At the beginning, Sweden laid out a really great framework. And so in the beginning, many countries said, okay, we're going to build on the 3 R's that then became the 4 R's of Swedish feminist foreign policy. And so that happened. But then as countries really looked within their own context, it has diversified greatly. We did find, though, that there were some fundamental concepts that cut across almost all of the feminist foreign policies. And the first one is this idea that Carrie referenced, that gender equality is both a goal and a strategy. Having greater gender equality in a country is something that countries are working across social, economic, and political realms. And in that strategy, you create more gender equality. But there's been quite a lot of research now from folks around the world that when you have greater gender equality within a country, they are more likely to abide by international treaties. They are less likely to be in conflict either internally or with another country. And so with regard specifically to foreign policy, gender equality is both a goal and a strategy. The second fundamental concept is this idea that we're broadening the idea of what security means. As our good friend Don Steinberg often says, it was often men and guns talking to other men and guns about men and guns. And so it was very state-centered. It was about countries' informal violence or conflict with each other. But if anything has come out of the past 5 years with the pandemic and other issues, is that security doesn't feel that way. If there is, you don't know if you have a job, you don't know if you have access to healthcare, you are not safe walking home at night. Those are security issues. And so feminist foreign policy really thinks broader, food security, climate change, and other issues, so that we're thinking about security in a more broad way, which you're addressing more issues, but you're also thinking more broadly about the solutions that should be considered to address this broadened definition. Another aspect of it, which Carrie mentioned, is this elevation of diverse voices. So it's not just add more women. A lot of people, that's the first thing they go to, is they want to point to the number of women in the cabinet or the number of women in parliament, or their ministers. But really, it's thinking more broadly about women and men. Not every woman is a feminist. Not every feminist is a woman. And so thinking more broadly within government, across government, and between governments. So it's not just the government officials or people who have titles, but who are the people impacted by foreign policy, and what is their say? Their government might ask for an action, but it's really going to be disproportionately impacting people in their country that would prefer not to have that. So how do you really have these conversations with people in and out of government who are impacted by foreign policy? And then the last fundamental concept is this desire to address historic power imbalances. There are power imbalances. The US has a very large footprint around the world. So how do we think about that differently when we're interacting with other countries? How do we address racism, colonialism, patriarchy in the work that we do? But it's also addressing those power balances within our own government. If you look at the US government budget, it is not balanced across all the levers of foreign policy. And our Department of Defense gets a huge amount of money compared to what we invest in development and diplomacy. So how can we write that? If all the tools you're investing in are guns and bombs, then that's the one you're going to go to. So let's think more broadly about the way we interact with other countries and individuals, and let's invest in those strategies so that they are ready to go and they are as robust as the other ones. So those are kind of the overwhelming concepts regarding feminist foreign policy. And I turn it back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So inspiring and exciting to hear about this framework and to get started. Okay, so we are now going to kick it over to learn more about the civil society perspective. Gayatri Patel is the Chief External Affairs Officer at the Malala Fund, and former Vice President of Advocacy at the Women's Refugee Commission and Director of Gender Advocacy at CARE. She previously served in positions in the State Department advising on human trafficking, refugee and migration policy, and multilateral diplomacy. She is an original steering committee member of the Coalition for a Feminist Foreign Policy in the US and previously led civil society coalitions related to gender-based violence, women's economic empowerment, and child marriage. I've learned a lot from you over the years and look forward to hearing your perspective now from civil society organization.
Great. Thank you so much, Caroline. And thank you to AFL and to SMASH for hosting this event. The civil society perspective here is so broad and so wide ranging, but unlike Susan, I am from the civil society advocacy community, and I can say should and must and really use that type of language when engaging governments, including the US government. Stepping back a little bit, the genesis of what we consider kind of the framework for feminist foreign policy in the US right now really started kind of with a group of thinkers and gender equality, civil society experts and leaders back in 2018, when we were really, in the throes of, okay, this is a moment in US history. We have an administration that is potentially not going in the right direction on issues of gender and feminism, but let's look ahead. What do we want a feminist foreign policy, feminist policy in the United States to look like? And we really started thinking through, the definition. Like Susan said, and Stephanie, the definition can take multiple dimensions in any context. With the US context, given its large footprint, given its large influence, we really centered on building out a definition that reflected not just gender and not just women, but gender equality, racial equality, non-discrimination, human rights, diversity of voices and opinions at policy and decision-making tables. Also emphasized a real meaningful engagement of a broad base of impacted communities, leaders, et cetera, in the development of foreign policy, and really thought through, just what are the elements of it. We're not just talking about government structures. We're also talking about relationships with non-state actors, civil society, impacted communities, et cetera. From this definition and from this thinking, we then looked at, okay, what is it that we want to see? What is this vision that we want to see from the US government? And in terms of, policy articulation, leadership and structures, resourcing, budget, accountability measures, what are the key steps that we think a good framework for a feminist foreign policy in the US should absorb and reflect? Fast forward 2020, we had an election, President Biden was elected, and we now saw a huge opportunity to really kind of advance this forward. And so the civil society effort was really, I think, defined by the fact that we started early. We built coalitions, recognizing that solidarity was critical here. So it wasn't just gender equality coalitions. It was coalitions and organizations working on immigration, working on racial justice, working on LGBTQI rights, working on defense and development, to really come together on, what are the key pieces of envisioning and implementing feminist principles through the implementation of foreign policy by the US. I think the other aspect of civil society efforts is really the emphasis that we put on structural change. We weren't talking about one-off, initiatives and programs. We were talking about whole of government approaches. How do we embed this in the very kind of structures of the State Department, USAID, Department of Defense, trade, there's so many different aspects of it. We were also really emphasizing a comprehensive approach, recognizing that, yes, there's a space for, thinking through feminist foreign policy and feminist implementation in, development policy. But we also need to look at economic growth and trade and diplomacy, and all of the various levers through which foreign policy is adapted. And then finally, I think really taking a holistic approach, that this is not just about, key issues. It's not just about gender-based violence. It's not just about women's economic empowerment. It's about human rights. It's about climate change. Susan and Stephanie listed it. It's about making sure we have, a fair debt distribution and debt restructuring, and really taking in, the idea that we need to address the power imbalances that the U.S. has perpetuated, exacerbated, or just ignored for a very long time. And so we can get more into the details of what the outcome of some of this civil society push has been. But I think the real momentum started for us when the Biden-Harris administration took office. We really saw an opportunity. We really captured it, and that really took those coalitions that we built to demand an audience with the transition teams at each agency, with the nominees that were pending confirmation for key positions. Really using our public and behind the scenes voices to push for specific policy changes, not only to gender focused policies, but also to procurement and nominations, et cetera. And finally, really pushing for a solid articulation of a feminist foreign policy from day one of the Biden-Harris administration. We didn't get it, but we got very close, and we can talk a little bit more in detail about that down the line. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Super interesting, and as we'll talk about in Q&A, just so interesting in terms of thinking about the parallel conversations that were happening in the domestic policy making space, over the past several years. So anyway, let's move on and think about kind of what this looks like from the national government perspective, from two countries, from Colombia and Germany. We are now so fortunate to have Arlene Tickner, who is Colombia's first at-large ambassador for gender issues and feminist foreign policy. She also served as Colombia's deputy permanent representative to the United Nations. Previous to her service in government, she enjoyed a decades-long career in Colombia as a professor of international relations with expertise in security, foreign policy, and global South world politics. Ambassador, we're so happy to have you. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Caroline. I'm going to put a timer on just so I don't speak too much. I want to just thank ASIL as well as Stephanie and Susan, who recruited me to participate in this panel. I'm sitting in the corridor of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in a chair where people are walking by, and there's a bit of an echo. So please bear with me. You can hear me okay, I hope.
It's fine.
Okay, before I go into our feminist foreign policy, I think it's important to contextualize the origins of this policy within the context of, I would say, tremendous and profound social and political change in Colombia during the past years. So let me just start by pointing out to those who are not familiar with Colombia that this is a country with long-standing armed conflicts. I will call them conflicts in plural, because we have still any number of violent non-state actors still operating in the national territory, both what we would call your classic political insurgent groups, but also organized criminal organizations and paramilitary groups that have made for a tremendously complex and entrenched conflict or conflicts. High levels of violence, and in particular, violence directed against human rights defenders and social leaders, concentrating in women, Afro-descendants, indigenous peoples, and whatnot. Our peace process that ended in the 2016 peace accord between the Colombian state and the FARC insurgency was a process in which women's organizations of all stripes actually took the lead impressing for the need for a peace negotiation, and actually, I would say making it happen. And this peace accord has been looked at worldwide as a model for several reasons. First, it's one of the first peace accords, at least to my knowledge, that makes gender transversal to the entire peace accord, and had a very heavy component, at least in the second stage of the negotiations, of women participating, both women insurgents, women from the military, and women in politics and representing civil society. The second kind of distinctive aspect is that it has a specific ethnic chapters called to address historical injustices committed against indigenous peoples and Afro-descended communities in particular, but with strong emphasis on women as, one of the main targets of violence, discrimination, inequality, and whatnot. And third, just to mention it, and I won't go into it, there's a very novel, innovative transitional justice system that's part of the peace accord that heavily emphasizes reparations, restoration, and truth, and over a more punitive lens that accompanies some transitional justice processes. And here too, issues related to gender-based violence, conflict-related sexual violence have been very important within the context of the transitional justice process. So basically what I want to say by this is not only that women have been key, but also that the Peace Accord of 2016, in a context, again, of longstanding and entrenched armed conflicts and groups that remained and continue to remain after this Peace Accord, basically led to a tremendous degree of social upheaval in the country starting in around 2019, which we saw emerging in many countries in Latin America. But I think what's distinctive about the Colombian case is that social upheaval and social protests have been quite sparse in this country. And I would attribute this to, again, to the existence of our armed conflict, which has kind of served as, something that's held back the expression of social discontent and whatnot. And this social upheaval led to the elections of 2022, ending in the election of the first progressive, or if you wish, leftist government in Colombian history, of Gustavo Petro and Francia Marquez, the first also Afro-descendant woman to be elected vice president. And during the campaign, there was a commitment both to placing women at the center of the government's policies and priorities, kind of with the idea that the government without women, change is impossible. And this government has described itself as a government of change. And second, there was a commitment to create a feminist foreign policy, which I'll try to get into in a moment. The basic slogan of the government is Colombia, a world power for life. And I think this jives actually quite comfortably with feminist principles, or feminist ethos, I like to call it, in the sense that the idea here is that the protection and dignification of life, both human and other than human, is at the core of both our domestic and foreign policy, along with the search for structural change. Colombia is one of the most unequal countries in the world, with one of the most unequal land distributions in the world as well. And this is largely at the root of the conflicts that we've experienced over time. So basically, when we think about foreign policy, and I think our foreign policy overlaps, again, quite comfortably with what I'll call our feminist foreign policy. And the two are not exactly the same in most countries, but they have interesting articulations and overlaps. There's several pillars of our foreign policy that I think feed quite comfortably and nicely into our feminist foreign policy. The first is the notion of total or integral peace, with a strong emphasis on human security, but a human security, I think, understood in a more broad and comprehensive sense. The government is currently negotiating with almost all of the remaining non-state violent actors operative in our national territory, be they of the more political strain or the more criminal strain. The criminal part has been a bit controversial, as you can imagine, but the argument here is that it's impossible to achieve a lasting and integral and solid and robust peace unless we provide conditions of security for populations in the national territory, in particular those vulnerable social groups most affected by violence, conflict, inequality, and whatnot, starting with women in rural territories of the country. And the second has to do with social and I'll call intersectional justice. I think what's interesting, in the description of what's common in feminist foreign policies across the board in the world, we haven't mentioned intersectionality. In my mind, one of the main differences between a simple gender-based approach and feminist foreign policy is precisely the emphasis on intersectionality. And in our both our national development plan and in our feminist foreign policy, we expressly state that our policy is intersectional. This is very much at the root also of the government's approach to social justice, understanding that injustice, discrimination, violence, and whatnot is deeply rooted in intersecting and articulated sources of identity, be they gender, race, social class, ethnicity, disability and whatnot, sexuality, sexual orientation and whatnot. And a third has to do with the environmental crisis. My president and my vice president are quite vocal advocates of the need to introduce profound changes in the way that we are in and with the world as the only source of salvation for both humans and other than humans. And this has led to tremendous visibility on the part of our government today in conversations on the environmental crisis. And third, just several other issues that we're working on within our feminist foreign policy, drug policy reform and migration and human mobility. Colombia has become a transit country for migrants moving from both Venezuela and other parts of the world upwards to north through the Darien Gap, something that we had never had to deal with in this tremendous volume as we do today. And also we've received approximately 3 million Venezuelans who now reside and have been, formalized within the national territory. And so all of these facets of our foreign policy and basically the idea of Colombia as a power for life, I think we've taken and fed into what I'll now call our feminist foreign policy. I'm going to quickly end. I think I had 10 minutes and I have just a minute and a half to end. So let me just, I'm describing both foreign policy and feminist foreign policy at the same time. Both our feminist foreign policy declares itself as intersectional, which I've already spoken about, pacifist and participatory. So you asked me to talk about the pacifist nature. In my mind, any feminist foreign policy is by nature pacifist. Let me just say that from the start. In terms of participation, which we've also mentioned, both our National Action Plan on 1325 and our feminist foreign policy have been co-constructed with feminist and women's organizations across the national territory, with particular emphasis on those areas of the country that have rarely participated in national conversations about domestic and foreign policy. I think participation obviously is at the root of any feminist foreign policy, as we've said, and genuine participation in the sense that we create processes of co-construction. Actually, all of our public policy is now being constructed in this way. This is messy. It takes a long time. It sometimes creates, I would say, overblown kind of Christmas trees of hopes and wishes, but it's actually one of the only ways we feel to both do justice to the voices of different actors in the national territory, especially those who have been marginalized and excluded, but also to create a strong sense of propriety and appropriation of these policies to make them lasting across time. In terms of the pacifist nature, let me just again repeat that for me, any feminist foreign policy has to be by nature pacifist. But our foreign policy writ large is profoundly pacifist. My president and my vice president are very also outspoken on the need to de-escalate, demilitarize, and seek out negotiated settlements to all types of armed conflicts taking place in the world today, not only ours. And in that sense, we are strong advocates for the defense of human rights and pacific ways of negotiating and settling different types of controversies that we see both in Colombia and across the world. And so this is basically at the center of what we would call our foreign policy and our feminist foreign policy. I've gone over 1 minute, so I don't want to continue. And I hope that I've done justice to the questions, but we can talk more in the Q&A if there's specific things you'd like me to go into in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Tickner. That was very interesting, and definitely kind of just, I'm going to put a pin in the question about kind of pacifism in feminist foreign policy, and want to return to that with the other speakers, hear your thoughts in the Q&A. But first, we are going to hear from Elizabeth Franz, who is a political counselor at the German embassy in Washington, D.C. She is working on topics such as human rights, migration, women, peace and security, and feminist foreign policy. Before joining the embassy, she was a transatlantic diplomatic fellow at the Department of State. And previous assignments of hers included one with the German Foreign Service, and her position at the German embassy in Ashgabat, as well as positions on the desk working on Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, as well as human resources and diplomatic training. So Elizabeth, we're so thrilled to have you today to talk about the German perspective.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much as well for having me, and especially to Susan, Stephanie, and Azel for inviting me to this panel. Feminist foreign policy is really one of the most important topic for our minister. It was it started off when we had a new government in Germany. We have coalition governments, meaning several parties have to create a coalition, and also usually they negotiate some kind of coalition treaty. And it was very important for the Green Party to put already in that coalition treaty the fact that Germany will have a feminist foreign policy. So, like, part of the coalition treaty was the sentence that they really assured that together with our partners, Germany wants to strengthen the rights, resources, and representation of women and girls worldwide, and promote social diversity in the spirit of a feminist foreign policy. I have to say, and it was mentioned before, that it was not easy to put that sentence into that coalition treaty already, not because of the content, but because of the term feminist foreign policy. It was touched upon before that it's sometimes for some people still a trigger word, but I will maybe dive into that a little bit later as well. Then at the next step, it was also already mentioned that feminist foreign policy or policy changes don't happen overnight. So the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Germany's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, developed 10 guidelines on feminist foreign policy, and they were released on March 8 in 2023. So we have been having a feminist foreign policy, an official feminist foreign policy, I would say, for the past year and a half. With what has been said already, at the core of our feminist foreign policy lies the strengthening of rights, representation, and resources for women and marginalized groups. And they were split into 10 different guidelines that covered 2 dimensions. The first dimension was external, is an external dimension for external action. The second dimension is an internal dimension, because as I think also other countries who already had a feminist foreign policy noticed that sometimes they did not take into account the need to also look at the internal part of a ministry that has to implement a feminist foreign policy. So that was and is a very important part of our feminist foreign policy as well. And in the external dimension, there are several topics. They all target women and marginalized groups in the areas of peace and security policy, humanitarian assistance and crisis management, human rights policy, climate diplomacy, and external energy policy, foreign trade and investment policy, as well as cultural and societal diplomacy. I also want to mention that Germany also has, the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, has their own feminist development policy. It was released together with the feminist foreign policy of our Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I think one of the things for me that are important always to mention that, as I said, it's very important to have those guidelines, but it's very important also to implement them and to really put them into action. And the idea was and is that feminist foreign policy should be like a common thread that goes through all the work of the foreign service. And that also means definitely that the employees of the Federal Foreign Office in Germany play a very important integral part in the implementation. So we use the term to create a feminist reflex. That means that when a decision has to be taken, or when their program is being organized, when we write a report, when we fund a project and it has potential repercussions for the entire society, we have to really, or we should always take into account, or at least think about a feminist perspective, like how could that affect women and other marginalized groups? Would it affect them, and have we taken that into account? And I think that's like a work in progress, definitely. And it also means that that we need sometimes more information about societies, about culture that we had in mind before implementing a feminist foreign policy. Of course, I think most of my colleagues try to do that before even having a feminist foreign policy, but now with the reflex, it's really like put on paper, and to really have the understanding that you need to broaden your lens in order to see what is going on and how some things could affect society. Because societies can be very different, and things that can be helpful in one society can be detrimental in another one. Another important part of our feminist foreign policy is the introduction of gender budgeting to all Federal Foreign Office project funds. That means that by 2025, 85% of our project funds shall be allocated to projects that include the promotion of gender equality for women and marginalized groups. And 8% of our project funds will be allocated to projects that mainly focus on promoting gender equality for women and marginalized groups. We have already achieved that 100% of our humanitarian aid does reflect the gender perspective. And also over 2023, we could see that there has been that many projects had a gender transformative or gender sensitive component. So I wanted to emphasize also, as has been said before, that intersectionality plays a big role in our feminist foreign policy, and that it is supposed to be inclusive, and that's also a very important part to mention when talking about feminist foreign policy, that it's not directed against men, it's not to lecture anyone, but we seek to a dialogue on equal footing with other states and civil societies to find like a better understanding. And it's not made by women for women, but it aims to involve all parts of society. And it can be very different also, depending on the cultural background, which groups in which society are marginalized. And that's also something that we have to take into account when implementing our feminist foreign policy. I wanted to touch on because I think it goes into the pacifist question already, because my minister said, I know at some point, that feminist foreign policy is not the same as a pacifist policy when she was talking about Ukraine. But I still think that we probably mean the same thing. I think feminist foreign policy is meant to foster peace and security for every person, and that's like the main goal. But at the same time, in a world where there are many weapons being used, where there are crises, where there are wars, sometimes like in the case of the brutal attack on Ukraine, it can be feminist foreign policy to support, in that case, Ukraine by, for example, delivering weapons. So what is an important part of our feminist policy that we reiterate usually is that feminist foreign policy and security policy are not mutually exclusive, but on the contrary, it puts security of the people at the center. And at the same time, this is something that feminist foreign policy cannot solve unfortunately, all problems at once. It's not a magic wand. So there's always the need to, it's a work in progress, which is also really put down in our guidelines, that it's not a done deal. We have now these guidelines, we will implement them, and then everything will be fine. It's more complicated than that. And that is one thing I also want to highlight, that the guidelines have been developed in a very close exchange with civil society. There were several events. There was a call for papers, and the results have been implemented or have become part of the guidelines. And also, after the release of the guidelines, there was a conference last fall in Germany, again with civil society, and it was so fruitful for both sides that the decision was made to have more of these conferences, like 2 to 3, maybe even every year, in order to have an open exchange about the implementation, the development, and also, maybe necessary changes to our feminist foreign policy.
Thank you. That was wonderful. So thanks to all of the panelists for such a interesting array of perspectives and experiences. So we have a little over a half hour left in the program. And so I want to make sure that we do leave enough time for Q&A from the audience and from the participants. I want to maybe pick up on a few of the questions or the themes that were just kind of raised in the Colombian and German context, and then maybe kick it back over to Stephanie, Susan, and Gayatri to help us kind of understand this from kind of the big picture perspective. So this question about standard setting, I'd like to go to that because I would like it if you all could talk a little bit more about kind of how standards are being set, and then kind of who is either the decision, is there a decision-making body? Is there talk of a decision-making body? Is there and what is the forum through which these discussions are happening between countries and civil society and international organizations about standard setting? And is there a vision for direction forward with this? Are there gatekeepers? Are there kind of standard bearers that are either in place or that are kind of viewed as a long-term goal? So I don't know, Stephanie and Susan, if you maybe want to talk about that in the larger context, and then Gayatri, if you could speak about that from the civil society perspective. And Ambassador Tickner, yes, you need to leave in a minute, and we want to thank you so much for taking the time to be with us and sharing your thoughts and perspectives in the evolution of the story in Colombia. We look forward to hearing more.
So I'll jump right in. So in also a true feminist fashion, right? There's no kind of feminist police coming to say, yes, you have a feminist foreign policy, or no, you don't. A few years ago, a civil society organization based in the US, the International Center for Research on Women, ICRW, did attempt to kind of do an outline of what the bare minimum standards are for a feminist foreign policy, just because it came to be that some governments were announcing feminist somethings in order to just say that they had a feminist something. And so it was like, well, can anyone say it? And of course, anyone or any government can say it, but they were trying to, and I think civil society around the world has been trying to kind of say what minimum standards are, or what civil society is looking for. There have been at least 2 or 3 kind of gatherings. I don't know if global conference is too large of a word, but one in Europe, there was just one in Mexico around the 1st of July. I know that groups came together up in New York around UN meetings to talk about things like this. And interestingly, a group of governments came together to sign a paper saying that they intended to look at or think about. I was actually just trying to find it in my papers because it's been very interesting to me, the divide. I don't know how strong of a word to put on it, but that civil society has much loftier ambitions than I think a lot of governments are willing to put forward. Even though I have to say the two that we've heard from today have been very both bold and specific. I think that they it may not be the same for every country that has announced it. So I think there are several organizations, both based in the countries, civil society organizations that are working on this. There's an international collaborative that is bringing together civil society actors around this feminist foreign policy. But I don't know of any, besides the one time on the side of the UN meeting, if there have been other times when governments have come together. I know that they have sometimes come together to talk about, okay, how do we implement this in our program? But I don't know if there's been, as per the question in the chat, where governments have come together to say, can all of us feminist foreign governments come to affect greater global change? I don't know about that. So I'm going to stop talking and hand it over to Stephanie or Gayatri to add on or correct what I've said.
Maybe I can also jump in because I know like in at the UN there is a formal group that is called FFP Plus, and it was at least 18 states. There might have been others that joined since I heard last about it, but and it's partly countries who have a feminist foreign policy, and other countries who think about having a feminist foreign policy. So it's not like an exclusive group only for people who are committed to a feminist foreign policy in writing. And the goal of that group is like to have an exchange about feminist foreign policy, but also to promote the values, like the content of feminist foreign policy on the multilateral change, as there has been and there is a pushback against some of the women's rights that have been achieved already, or also rights for other marginalized groups, and to really work closely together in order to organize better, to have a pushback, but also, and that's why it's called FFP Plus, to talk about feminist foreign policy. And there is obviously also an exchange about what it means, what it can mean, or who does what in what way. Maybe that helps also to answer the question.
Add, and I see Gayatri wants to say something, that also we need to look at, as Susan said, people can say they have a feminist foreign policy. We always say it's easier to say it than do it. I mean, for some people, it's hard to even say it. But I think being very clear about the importance of accountability. You can say you have a feminist foreign policy, but what does that mean? And I would argue some countries that say they have one are really not doing a lot. Whereas some countries that don't say they have a feminist foreign policy, or don't, they may say they have a gender responsive policy, or they don't label it at all, are actually taking steps that are very similar to other countries that have a feminist foreign policy. So I think it's an evolving kind of landscape, and being we're only 10 years in, if we think about this conversation, it's only been going on for 10 years, and which isn't a really long time. So I think it's important to think about it as a continuum of how do we evaluate a country's commitment to a feminist foreign policy, whether or not they call it that or not.
Stephanie, that leads really well into what I was going to say, which is really, I mean, I can't comment on the global standard setting process, but in the US, the civil society has really focused on the close relationship between standard setting for the US government and accountability mechanisms. and really looking at the things that can be measured and how we can hold the government to account. The things around funding levels. One of the clearest recommendations that we pushed very strongly with the US government is to ensure that at least 20% of all international affairs funding was gender prime. So it had gender as a primary focus of the programming, of the funding use. And that 100% would be at least gender informed. So, how that plays out in practice is incredibly difficult in a complex budget and appropriations context like in the US, but it sends a clear message that we are investing as a government in this type of work. Other kind of clear bright lines are gender analysis. This is a practice that USAID, the US Agency for International Development, took up and kind of became a model within the US government on how to kind of capture and implement gender analysis. We want that to be across the board, not just for development, but also for humanitarian assistance, also for defense spending, et cetera, so that we know that we have reached that benchmark of gender is assessed and a gender lens is used in considering how the US government is allocating and using its resources through foreign policy. But the accountability really comes with, are they reporting and are they making the reports public so that civil society and the general public can really review progress and kind of keep going with what we want to see. Are they measuring the right things? And we certainly have opinions on what should be measured and what counts, but we can't really engage in that conversation meaningfully if the reporting isn't public. So I think from an internal kind of US specific perspective, that's how civil society has really seen the process of standard setting and accountability.
Thank you so much. Great. Very interesting. Now, so I guess like moving forward, we're at a very interesting time in the United States, obviously, in terms of the election cycle and thinking about the next several months. Would anyone like to speak to kind of your recommendations for the candidates? Any organizing that's going on, engagement with the campaigns about this question of kind of what a feminist foreign policy might continue to look like and a vision for that in the United States and beyond. So anything in the US context about where those conversations or engagements are or may be happening?
I'm going to leave it to others to talk maybe more specifically about that, but I do think it's a good opportunity to really build on something that Elizabeth said, and in the US context, but I think this is true globally, because governments are governments wherever you go. I mean, feminist foreign policy or any type of foreign policy change, we're talking about a transformative kind of change. It's not going to happen overnight, and it's not a panacea. I think Elizabeth said it's not a magic wand, which is true. And I think the challenge is every day, the conversations that people are having with the campaigns and with the people inside the government are important, because it's very hard to move these institutions, particularly in a country like the United States, which has the most, massive government sort of set of institutions of any government in the world. We employ, hundreds of thousands of people, and they are deployed across the globe in terms of diplomacy, development, and defense and trade. And so thinking about what does this really mean to say you're advocating for a feminist foreign policy or even a gender-focused foreign policy when you're saying to somebody who walks into the, Harry S. Truman building, which is the headquarters of the State Department, or the Ronald Reagan building, which is the headquarters of USAID, or the Pentagon, we want you to do your job differently. Feminists, what does that mean? And Gayatri touched on gender analysis, and of course, sex disaggregated data is integral to that. How do we help people within these institutions understand that this helps them do their jobs better and more effectively? And of course, our job as bureaucrats, when I used to be one as a diplomat, is to help decision makers make the best decisions possible with the best information possible. So I think the conversations aside, and I think there are many conversations ongoing about what's going on in the context of US politics, which is important, of course, but I think it's important to just put a pin in this whole notion of how difficult it is to make change. And Susan and I do a lot of these talks, and I am well known as an institutionalist, and I believe strongly in the institutions, and I'm all about that, how we make the institutions much more resilient and effective. But in reality, it's about how we help individual people do their jobs. And that's the challenge, because you have to make that case over and over and over again, day after day after day, in the institutions. And I think, that goes to how the institutions are structured and the role of advocates, both inside and outside of the institutions, pushing for that kind of change.
But Stephanie, the point of a feminist foreign policy is to not live in this box that we've been given, is that we have to have a strong vision so that people aren't just tinkering around the edges and doing their jobs a little bit better, even though we want that. We want more gender representation. We want broader voices, all the kind of fundamental concepts. But in the end, the idea is to think of it in a new way, that we're actually going to engage with people around the world in a way that will make for less conflict. And so I try to balance what you're saying within the institutions, but also we can still urge our friends and our colleagues, and even not our friends and colleagues, to think much in a bigger way. And how can we think differently, about all the conflicts that exist and all the ones that we ignore that are going on that the US government isn't engaged in because it's in our political interest. So I think part of the tension is also this, my instinct, like perhaps we need to do a little burning in order to kind of bring new institutions and new processes and functions so that we don't end up repeating this, which I think we all agree is not working right now.
I love that revolutionary spirit, Susan, and I might be even further along in the let's burn things down perspective. But I think in the US, and perhaps this applies in Germany and Colombia as well, we're at a really kind of interesting moment where we could have, the next president of the United States being someone who I believe has called herself a feminist, and a new or renewed opportunity to really continue the policies that started in the Biden administration that have gotten us closer and closer to having feminist approaches to policymaking and the content of foreign policy. But I think my hope and my recommendation for the candidates is really from the onset of their administration to think through how to continue some of those efforts, but also really take a retrospective look at how the US has engaged on three key pillars. And this is my personal perspective. Number one, how has the US government stood up for bodily integrity when it comes to sexual and reproductive health and rights, LGBTQI rights to freedom from gender-based violence? Recognizing that this is not just a domestic controversy, this has implications for the US development policy, global health funding, democracy promotion efforts all around the world. Secondly, how has the US government shown up in climate action discussions? Has it really centered feminist approaches, not just in the process of climate action, but also the content? And I would really recommend doing it in a different way going forward, which is having a more intentional effort to engage feminist actors in climate action. And third, and really look at the inequities that come from climate change and addressing those through the structural changes that are needed. And third, and I really want to emphasize this, really doubling down on, I wouldn't say pacifist, but an approach to conflict that prioritizes nonviolent conflict resolution and is aimed at ending wars. We've seen Afghanistan, we've seen Gaza, we've seen Ukraine miss a number of opportunities to approach this in a nonviolent feminist manner, and those opportunities have been missed. And you know, in the reality that conflict exists, ensure that humanitarian response also has a feminist framing to it. So, and ensuring inclusion, ensuring that inequities are assessed so that aid is distributed according to need.
I would like to add, I mean, obviously I won't be talking about the US side of it, but I just wanted to underline and add that it takes a lot of convincing also within the ministry, within a society. And specifically, I wanted to underline something that my minister said during one speech, because I really liked it. She said that, and I know all of you know that the term feminist, I mean, creates for some people really kind of like I want to say a defense mechanism. It's like people want to argue about it, and what she said was like she could have, or we could have called our policy with a different name, same content, but not feminist foreign policy, and probably there would have been less debate about that. But she specifically said that it was important also to use that title to have that discussion, because it's important to talk about the issues and in order to have to create a change that is lasting. Otherwise, it's just some policy you put into place. There's no discussion. As we are good servants for the government, we will implement what we have to implement. But if the discussion is not there, then the change cannot take roots as much as it needs to in order to really change something. And that does not mean that we have to burn down our Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I would be against that. And I also want to say that also with the feminist foreign policy we are using tools that we have been using before. I mean, I guess most of you know definitely the panelist WPS, or national action plans, but also other toolkits we had already were only put into the guidelines, but they existed before. So there's also a lot of things that we can use to build up on, and that's what Germany does and did. But obviously, for something like a feminist reflects something that changes the way we look on things, there has to be also a debate, and that's something that everybody can do every day, not only, as it was said already, not only in the institutions, but in everyday life, not to run away from a discussion about feminist foreign policy or other related topics. That
Wonderful. So interesting, and important. Can we talk a little bit more about kind of how this gets operationalized within governments, and particularly, you know, the component parts, the constituent parts of a particular government? You know, several of you kind of referred to the whole of government approach being critical for this, and several of you referred to both kind of this external and internal piece. You know, as you know, as you referred to, Elizabeth, you know, the easier said than done, right? To kind of assemble the whole of government, both in terms of policy making and internal structures. Are there examples that any of you would like to point to, either real examples that you can talk about, or hypothetical examples of, you know, where the give and take happens, where something, you know, where there's an opportunity to move something forward through perhaps a particular agency or department. Maybe it's on the defense side or the development side, where you kind of seize opportunity to move something forward, even if kind of the whole of government vision may not be there or possible. Or likewise, are there particular moments where structurally a government is poised to move forward? If there's any kind of guidance you might be able to give about how that gets operationalized, you know, in a particular country context.
I mean, I would say a couple things. Again, this is why Susan and I wrote this book. It's such a joy to have that conversation every day. But, you know, look, first of all, political will is very important. And that's one thing we haven't touched on. And I think that's true in Germany and Colombia and all the countries that have established a feminist foreign trade development policy. Certainly in the US, I mean, Secretary Clinton had a tremendous impact on the institutions of particularly the State Department. Not that she was advocating for a feminist foreign policy. We didn't use those words at the time, but she did change the way in which bureaucrats and the institutions had to think about engaging with women and civil society. I think it was, you know, looking back now, we probably think, oh, that seems very basic and obvious and, you know, maybe even kind of simplistic. But at the time, that was a very revolutionary idea, that when the Secretary of State went out for her travels to every country, she met with women's civil society groups, and she asked diplomats how, you know, what the impact was of our policies or our programs on women in civil society and girls and, you know, children. And I mean, that was not done before that in any kind of systematic way. Not to say former secretaries didn't care and that they didn't do it kind of in a more erratic way, but she really institutionalized that. So in the US, that's a great, I think, example of political will being really driving a change in the way the institution makes decisions or thinks about making decisions. The question is how much that impacted decisions, but I think that's there. One example I'm going to give, which I feel is now somewhat fraught with peril, but I'm going to go ahead with it because I worked on it, is Afghanistan. I mean, we know, just using that as an example, certainly there are some flaws in how our Afghanistan policy unfolded. One thing we did not do well, not just in Afghanistan, but in terms of a more, you know, across the board in terms of conflict-related negotiations and mediations, is follow our own women, peace, and security law and ensure that we're advocating for and that there are women in these the delegations that are trying to negotiate peace. You know, that's a first step. Now, is that necessarily it's not all you do to have a feminist foreign policy, but having women at the table certainly makes a difference in terms of the issues that get discussed and what kind of accountability there is. So I would say certainly with respect to Afghanistan, that did not happen in terms of the negotiations right before the fall of Afghanistan in 2020 and 2021. And that's, you know, I think that's very challenging. I would say that as we see, there's an effort to try to continue the drumbeat of advocating for the rights of women in Afghanistan as the US government continues to grapple with, and the international community, with the Taliban as the de facto rulers of the country with no legitimacy. So I think those are the kind of challenges, like how do you change that in the bureaucracy? How do you push that forward with all the competing imperatives that there are? And, you know, there are people who would say we need to reestablish negotiations, a diplomatic presence in Afghanistan. You know, most women's groups and feminists would say absolutely not, though there are some who would agree with that. So I think it's all looking at how those decisions are influenced and how to bring a more feminist perspective to things like that, and and starting with things that seem, again, kind of like Secretary Clinton's idea that we, diplomats needed to meet with women civil society groups, or that she did, that we need to have women at every negotiating table in equal numbers. Now, that doesn't guarantee an outcome or any specific policy outcome for sure, but it's something that's foundational to the rest of what we're all talking about.
Thank you. Susan?
Well, I also think this idea of gender or sex disaggregated data is so fundamental. Stephanie and I always talk about that, like our dream is that there's a gender angle to the president's daily briefing. Like no issue is gender blind. And so while I think we've made great strides when it comes to some development programs and certainly through the State Department, things that we're doing. But just this week, I read 2 reports, one laying out like what future US foreign policy should look like, and it was completely gender blind. I was like, I don't even know how this is possible. But people continue who are in the policymaking space are not willing to recognize. And as Elizabeth said, it's not about women for women. But there are gendered angles to what is going on with our foreign policy. The Ukrainian conflict has been one of the most gendered wars. The language that Russia uses, that Ukraine is a woman, that they're taking over, the usage of his language, the response from Macron in France, like posting pictures of him out without his shirt on, lifting weights. Like it's this huge gendered aspect of men and women and how they're impacted by these policies and the responses to them. And so I think that the gender backs it up. I mean, the gender data backs it up that men and women are, and sex disaggregated data backs it up that men and women and people of all genders are impacted differently by a lot of our foreign policy. But it's shocking how much information coming out from think tanks in Washington, D.C. and around the world still do not take gender into account when they're thinking about these really complex foreign policy issues. So I would push for intelligence and data.
And requirements to some degree, right? Like if we're not requiring the institutions to take a gender lens to when they're assessing policy or considering policy decisions, they're not necessarily going to take it. And if we're going to require it, we have to resource the ability to understand what having a gender lens means. So I think those are critical aspects too.
Great. Thank you. Elizabeth, was there anything? Yeah. Did you want to? No, you're good. Okay. Sorry, I thought you came off mute, but that was my screen. Okay, great. Well, we just have a few more minutes. We've answered most of the questions that have come into the Q&A, but I just want to summarize kind of a few big picture points that have come in. And again, several of you have touched on these themes already, but just kind of talking about the most significant obstacles to creating and fostering feminist foreign policy. Is it learning about how to see the world differently through a feminist lens or particular sectors of government agencies? Is it from powerful anti-gender groups or mobilizations worldwide, both those inside the US and also globally? And then also kind of related to that, another participant expressed a concern about kind of, when does feminist foreign policy, when can it become virtue signaling without changing anti-feminist policies? And this relates back to some of the points that several of you made about the intersection of kind of foreign policy and feminist foreign policy. And where, again, kind of how we go about thinking about those obstacles, both within kind of the construction of foreign policy, as well as kind of the lenses and sectors that are engaged in this process. So I know those are big questions, but any additional thoughts?
I just want to maybe underline that, as has been said before, that I mean, all of us know that, but we don't live in a world where I mean, Germany decides to have a feminist foreign policy, and then we put feminist policies or gender based policies and policies that focus on underrepresented groups in the center, and then everything changes. That's just not how it is working. And I mean, we have been talking about crisis, war in Ukraine, for example, before. And I mean, with the government I have, or we have in Germany right now, with the minister from the Green Party, I think before the attack of Russia on Ukraine, it would have been very difficult to imagine that Germany, with the support of a Green minister or several, would talk about so much about delivering weapons to a different country. And then just the entire perspective changes because the world changes, because other players may not have a feminist foreign policy, for example, and other goals. And that's something we still have to respond to, and that sometimes requires to adapt the perspectives, not while forgetting the overall goals of feminist foreign policy, because as our minister also said, it's not a contradiction. In that case, it goes, for example, it's about the security of the women in Ukraine, of marginalized groups, and you know, every Ukrainian basically, but I mean also the women who have been also targeted with conflict-related sexual violence, and to have that, like, that's also part of the equation that has to be taken into account, and that can change decisions that you would take differently if you were just thinking more theoretically about feminist foreign policy. I don't know. I hope I make sense right now with what I'm trying to say, but I really wanted to put that out, that it's often in international relations, as most of us probably know, very complicated to put into to have all sides in mind, because you are dealing with players who might have a completely different rule book. And you have to adapt to that in order to still achieve the most important goals you have. And you might not succeed, or it might not look from the outside as if you are succeeding, even though you are trying very hard to still implement the core basis of the feminist foreign policy values.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That's so helpful. Well, we're just about at time. I want to just really kind of wrap up by emphasizing, both the process and the substance that you all have talked about. That's critical for feminist foreign policy. The ideas of prioritizing civil society informed processes, and mobilizing government staff, this whole of government approach. Thinking about kind of what deliverables and policy directions can and should look like, what structural changes at agencies may be necessary or within the federal government, and then thinking about kind of many of these global engagement questions. So those are a lot of really important themes that you all have pointed to, and I'm just so thrilled that we had this opportunity, and grateful to ASIL, and particularly to Taylor and Brita and James for organizing this panel and being so integral to bringing us together, and all of the background work that nobody sees. They were deeply involved with, and I want to thank the three of you and ASIL, and as an ASIL member myself, I'm very excited and hopeful that these conversations will be continuing in various forms and forums within ASIL and beyond. So encourage you all to reach out. Those of you who are participating, feel free to reach out to us after the session if there's any follow-up conversations you'd like to have. And we look forward to future iterations of these conversations. Thank you to all of our panelists. Also, of course, you were wonderful and brilliant, and it's always wonderful to be together. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.